front for you here just a
Okay,
second.
go ahead.
Hey everybody, the reason we're moving you to the front for the video purposes is we need heads in the video so it doesn't look like it's empty. So if I can get all of y'all, the places I haven't taped off, if I can get you, go ahead and move to the front, and it'd be better really actually too if you were in the middle. If you would do that for us, please. Thanks.
Thank you.
Get them out. The elders told me I wouldn't be able to pull this off.
Maybe. We'll start in about one minute. We'll let everyone trickle in and the doors close.
Sing happy birthday to my wife, which is June the 8th.
Well, good morning, chapel class, and those of you who just wanted to come see Christianity get put on trial. I'm very excited to be able to present this to you, and I'm honored that y'all have me up here doing this. It's what I love to do. I hope that's apparent if y'all stick with me through these 12 weeks, and I hope that each one of you will go away encouraged, emboldened. Hopefully you'll learn something every week, and I think that we can accomplish that. I want to begin with the story that begins at the Market Diner in Dallas. Anybody ever been there? Can you smell the chicken fried steak? Okay, and I say that the chicken fried steak's good, but there's not much else there that's all that great. But I ate at the Market Diner probably once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, as a newly minted young lawyer, because my older mentor lawyer was supposed to take me to lunch every week, and that was his favorite spot to go. And as a second-year lawyer, I experienced something spiritually within me that started changing me. And it was God and Jesus speaking into my life and changing my heart. And it was apparent to me that my older mentor could really use what I had taken a hold of. And I just wanted to share it. And so there were times when I would just drop little God words at the end of conversations just to see how he'd react. And I wasn't very aggressive about it, but I tried to open the door at times to let him know, hey, let's talk about this stuff. So we're at our spot, the Market Diner, and the waffles are flying, the pancakes are going, the chicken fried steak's being served. It's impossible to eat healthy there because if you try to order vegetables, they're just horrendous. So you got to get something greasy. And I dropped one of my comments on him, and he responds, he was ready. So he responded with, and let me back up and tell you a little bit more about him. He was a Christian. He said he went to church, but obviously he didn't live like it. Probably went, maybe he was a Christmas and Easter kind of guy. But he was ready to stump me. And he said, all right, well, tell me this, Curt. If your God's so great, tell me about the child that grows up not 5 miles from here in West Dallas and doesn't have a chance, doesn't have an education, doesn't know who his father is. Mother's in and out of prison. Grandmother's doing the best she can to raise him and gets hooked on drugs at age 9 because his big brother makes him, starts fathering children at age 12. Tell me about why God would do that to that child. Tell me about the injustice of that, or tell me better about the justice of that. And he says, and what about this? What about the child that has leukemia? And instead of God just taking this child, right, we would all be upset at the death of a child. He says, what about the God that makes that child suffer in horrendous pain for over a year, and then he takes the child? Tell me about that. Okay, I thought I was ready, and with a lump in my throat and butterflies in my stomach, I start doing the best I can, and I talk about God's got a plan, and I give him some generalized answer about God's plan. I give him some generalized answer about God's plan. and I see his eyes just glaze over. And you guys have probably experienced this too. Someone asks you a God question, you start responding with something biblical and something correct, but the eyes glaze over, and you lost him. And I knew I lost him because I couldn't engage him on a better level. And that started a journey for me as a newly minted Christian. I knew I had this good thing with God. And many of you have good things going on with God, and you and God are great. You and the church are great. But if you go out in the broader intellectual community, can you converse with somebody who doesn't have a Christian background? Can you defend your faith at all? Not even defend it. Can you make it an intellectually viable option for them? And then I had this fear because I loved what I had with God. And I loved my own private time and my private study, and I got such strength from it. But I would mentally trip myself up with, what about this? I promise I'm not doing that. If I'm doing it, you tell me what I'm doing wrong. And I would mentally trip myself up with, what about this objection? What about that objection? And it would make me fearful to ever share my faith in any kind of intellectual setting with a non-Christian. I was just fearful. And many, I hope that some of you out there are fearful, because I think we can help with that. I think that this series will help with that. If you've come here fearful to share your faith and want to be emboldened, please stick with us for these 12 weeks. So that got me started on a journey. Okay, I'm doing great with God, but I need to read and I need to study and I need to figure out some of the good reasons we have for defending our faith. So I launched into some books, and this series is based on a lot of books. And we have done this, not this exact thing, but we have taught apologetics in this church for quite a while. You may not have known that it's been going on, but this is an intellectual church. And there's been apologetics taught for quite a bit of time. 2011, we had a Case for Christ series. 2012, Sunday morning series on defending the faith. Wednesday night in 2014. And then I got the title of this from a renowned trial lawyer in my circles. His name is Mark Lanier. And Mark's kind of a big deal. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but in my circles, he's a big deal. And he wrote a book called Christianity on Trial. And it's a brilliant idea. And we're going to take some of the resources from Mark, but really a lot of the resources from the other books as we go through this. But the idea is, can the Christian faith stand up to the evidence in a court of law? All the great American dramas seem to end in courtrooms. I mean, how many shows have you watched, even if they're not lawyer shows, but how many shows have you watched that seem to end in some kind of courtroom scene or begin with a courtroom scene? Us Americans, we love the courtroom. Thomas Jefferson said that he considers trial by jury the only anchor yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution. I'm going to say that again because I love that quote about the jury system. Thomas Jefferson said, I consider trial by jury the only anchor yet imagined by man by which a government can be held to the principles of its constitution. Trial by jury is ingrained in our American judicial system. It's what our country uses to sentence people to death row. It's what our country uses to award billions of dollars every year in damages to wronged people, wronged companies, and it's what we use to resolve disputes. So that system, if Christianity can stand up to anything, we can work through that system and we can put on evidence, and that's what I'm going to do. Next week, I'm going to give an opening statement and I'm going to begin putting on my case, and you guys are my jury. I feel like I've stacked my jury because I'm teaching this in a church, right? You guys are great jurors for this topic. I would love to have you on my jury, but I want you to weigh the evidence as a reasonable juror would. And we're going to talk about the burden of proof next week. We're going to talk about the criminal and the civil burden of proof and learn a little bit about the legal system. And if it's good enough for awarding billions of dollars in damages to people, then it's good enough. The burden of proof in our system is good enough to apply to Christianity. We ran through this in our New Beginnings class in November of last year, and it's a 12-week series. And so if you like my emoji, oh my goodness, it's 12 weeks, stick with us. Stick with us. We're going to cover quite a few topics. So next week, we're going to give an opening statement. I'm going to talk about the burden of proof, and I'm going to preview my argument for every topic. Then we're going to get into the evidence for a beginning. talk about Big Bang and what does that mean, and talk about creation, and talk about the universe, and a little bit of science. So if you're a science person, that stuff really gets you going, come for that one. How the universe is slowly running out of usable energy and how that strengthens the argument for the existence of God. And then we'll talk about the fine-tuning of the universe, how there's certain physical constants that are out there, electromagnetism, gravity, that if you move them or if you untune them within just a hair's breadth, human life becomes impossible. Life at all becomes impossible. And how is a universe so finely tuned for our existence and for us to thrive? We'll look at that as evidence of God. I'll put that on in my case. Then we'll talk about the moral law. And here's where we'll beat up a little bit on those who say that there is no absolute truth. There's no absolute truth. We'll talk about relativism. We will talk about what our children, and for those of you that are already there in college or about to enter college, we're going to talk about the worldview that's going to be thrust on you when you get there, of this overwhelming relativism. What's true for me may not be true for you. What's moral for me may not be moral for you. I like chocolate, you like vanilla. I want to go shoot up a school, you don't. Fine. We'll talk about how there's a moral law that everybody believes in, whether they say they do or not, and we'll talk about how that proves the existence of God. We're going to spend 2 weeks on that. And then for those of you non-science people that hung on through that, we're going to get into some history, so stay with me, because we're going to talk about the reliability of the Gospels. And this is what really started me. I was a history major. I wanted to know about this book because I was reading things that really strengthened my spirit. And the Holy Spirit told me this was true, and my relationship with Christ didn't need history, but I wanted to be able to explain to people, hey, no, this is real. These were real documents at one point on a scroll, and they've been faithfully preserved throughout the centuries. And you will leave that class knowing that if you believe in Alexander the Great, if you believe that guy existed, then you've got to believe that the Gospels accurately record history, because we have so much more reliable evidence for the Gospels than we do for Alexander the Great. We'll talk about original sources. We'll talk about how long after the fact these Gospels were written down and compare them to other ancient works. And we'll talk about the, quote, embarrassment of riches that we have when it comes to scholarship on the Gospels compared to other ancient works of that time. And then we'll discuss how these things were preserved. Are they corroborated? Are there other historical things that corroborate our gospel accounts? And you will leave that hopefully feeling encouraged. We're going to discuss the resurrection as a historical fact. The circumstantial evidence there is a really neat point. So when you talk about evidence, so we got direct evidence. If Blake Perkins walks in and I see it raining and I see him wet, I've got direct evidence that it's raining outside. But if I don't see the rain, but I see a lot of people come in and they seem to be soaked and they're putting up umbrellas and people take off their rain jackets, I don't have any direct evidence it's raining, but I've got circumstantial evidence. So that kind of evidence is awesome when you look at the resurrection. You look at the fact that these uneducated guys from a backwater province in Rome suddenly turn the Roman Empire upside down. How in the world did that happen? And these guys are dying for their beliefs? And they're in a position to know that it's false. Many people will die for their beliefs. Many people will die for their beliefs, even beliefs that may end up being false. But almost never, or I would venture to say never, will someone die for something they know is false. These guys were in a position to know whether the resurrection was a hoax. And church history tells us that they were dying for that. So we'll look at these neat little tidbits of circumstantial evidence when we get to that point. Then we'll deal with objections. What about all the evil in the world? This is the one that my mentor in the law firm really tripped me up with. What about all the evil in the world? And I think that's the single most powerful objection. But it's not a logical objection. It's an emotional objection. Because when you presuppose evil, you presuppose that there's a moral law by which we judge evil and good. If you believe in evil, then you believe in good, and you believe in a moral law by which we judge that. We'll discuss that when we get there on the logic part. But the problem of evil is more of an emotional one. And I think it's that emotion that makes it powerful. When you talk about children suffering, you talk about natural disasters, those things are hard. Those things are really hard to work through. And that is a very powerful objection. And then, hey, your God's a moral monster. He committed genocide in the Old Testament. He was commanding the Israelites to go slay tribes of Canaanites and kill all the babies and all the mamas. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about slavery. It's easy to lodge an objection about, hey, your God condones slavery. You know, it's in the Old Testament law, and then Paul's telling bondservants to obey their masters. What's that all about, man? Well, that could get you caught flat-footed too, so we'll discuss that. And then finally, we'll end with some tactics. Tactics comes from a great book by Greg Koukl, and his goal there is, and I love it that it takes the pressure off us, because Koukl's goal, and we'll discuss, I think our goal can be in these conversations, we're not trying to win the argument, we're not trying to win the day, and we're not trying to seal the deal. You know, let's bring them to Christ now in this one conversation. He says, look, just put a stone in their shoe. Just put a stone in their shoe. Give them a little bit of an inconsistency, show them something that may be inconsistent in the way they view the world. Maybe it's the moral law, maybe it's the scriptures, but put a stone in their shoe. And you never know what other events may lead them in the right direction. The end result of my case is going to be that Christian theism provides the best explanation for the world as we know it. The fine-tuning of the universe, the existence of human life, creation, the existence of truth and morality, the existence of the Gospels, the spread of a fringe religion called Christianity, and the problem of evil, the resurrection. Christianity provides comprehensive answers to all these, and I'll tell you this, no other worldview comes close. There are other worldviews. We'll examine those next time. We're going to map out the worldviews before I give you my opening statement, because we've got to have a backdrop of what we're competing against. But no other worldview has the explanatory power of the Christian faith. So I hope you leave emboldened. And I hope at the end of the case you vote for me and say, yes, we win. So why defend? Why bother doing this? Why do we have an exercise like this? First, in 1 Peter 3:15, it is commanded of us. 1 Peter 3:15 says, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is within you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So that make a defense, that word is apologia. This may be new to some of you. It's a Greek word, apologia. It's where we get apologetics. Has nothing to do with apologizing. Has nothing to do with saying, I'm sorry. It has to do with making a defense. And the word there corresponds more to making a legal defense or making a case. So make your case. Be prepared to make your case. This word's used 8 other times in the New Testament, mostly by Paul, but once here by Peter. Paul uses it quite a bit. Acts 22, chapter 22, verse 1, he says, he's giving his defense. He says, brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I now make before you. Hear the apologia that I now make before you. Philippians chapter 1, verse 16, Paul's saying, the latter do this out of love, knowing that I am put here for defense of the gospel, knowing that I am put here for the apologia of the gospel. So Paul takes this very seriously. He's talking about the legal defense and apologetics. Defending can be helpful in sharing. And let me share this with you. Ravi Zacharias says, never underestimate the role that you may play in clearing the obstacles in someone else's spiritual journey. A seed sown here, a light shown there may be all that is needed to move someone one step further. Just a little bit, just nudging them a little further and being prepared. The thing that warms my heart is there's so much great Christian scholarship out there. We have, and you may not know this, we have wonderful Christian philosophers, Christian historians, people who are analyzing biblical texts. We've got a wealth of riches when it comes to Christian scholarship. The problem is when I'm in one of those conversations, I want to grab one of them and say, hey, listen to this guy. Well, we can't do that. So we have to equip ourselves for this work. I want you to turn to Acts chapter 17, and we're going to look at how to share our faith in a secular world. We're going to look at the example of Paul. Paul is going to give us a roadmap of how we share with those who may be secularized. Starting in verse 16, it says, now while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. And some said, "What does this babbler wish to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a preacher of foreign divinities," because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? For you bring some strange things to our ears. We wish to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians, and I love this verse, now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing, except telling or hearing something new. What a cool way to live in Athens at that time. Just spend your time doing nothing but telling or hearing what's new. What's new? Oh, there's a new philosophy going on. It made me think of this. These are the Athenians of our day. Hanging out in coffee shops, laptops open, coffee's going, it's hot and steaming. What are the new ideas? Except that's the idealized version of a coffee shop. If you ever go to one now, it's everyone hunkered over their laptops, just looking at the laptop, which is why now I think some coffee shops are advertising no Wi-Fi. You come here, you don't get Wi-Fi. You come here, you got to talk. But I imagine that the Athens of that day was people hanging out, talking about new things. So Paul goes to the Areopagus. And this is an artist's rendering of the Areopagus of that time. And there's Paul before them. And so he's reasoning with the Epicurean and the Stoic philosophers in Athens, which is the birthplace of Epicureanism and Stoicism. This is an intimidating environment. And we've got Paul up there going toe-to-toe with these guys. This would be akin to getting some Harvard and Yale philosophers together and having one of us go up there and start reasoning with them about the resurrection. This is the intimidating environment that Paul is in. These guys have no conception of Christ. They've already called him a babbler. What's this guy saying? And we want to know more about it. So Paul says, okay, he's going to make his apologia. And get ready to see what he says. Verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship is unknown. This I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Yet he is actually not far off from each one of us." So he brings them in. He's not far off from each one of us. "For in him we live and move and have our being." He's quoting his own scripture, but he's not telling them, hey, I'm quoting from my Bible. He just says it. "For in him we live and move and have our being. And even as some of your own poets have said, for we are indeed his offspring." Paul, you're quoting a secular poet, man. We can't do that when we share, right? We just got to go with the Bible. No, Paul knew the literature of the day. He knew what would resonate with the people he's talking with. He was a cultured person. He knew his audience, and so he even quotes to them his secular poet. And notice how he opens up. He opens up being complimentary. He knew he'd get killed in the Roman Empire if you espouse a new religion. You make up a new religion and you're trying to get converts, you're dead. So he says, hey, I saw this statue that said, "To an unknown God." That's the one I'm telling you about. So he kind of works his way in that way. He tells them, you guys are very religious. He says, you guys are thinkers. Let me tell you about this unknown God. And then he even quotes one of their secular poets. That'd be like us quoting literature. Some kind of good literature, but not necessarily biblical, but, the Grapes of Wrath or something, right? He was well-read. And I love that part because it encourages us to be well-read Christians. Verse 29, "But then being God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of man. The times of ignorance of God are overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." So he drops the hammer. Here's where I'm going to lose a lot of people, Paul's thinking. I'm going to turn a lot of people off, but I preach the resurrection. He stays true to the message, but he gives it in a different way. He gives it in a way that's going to resonate with his audience. So he lost a lot of people. Verse 32 says, now when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again on this. They're obviously not intimidated. They're professors. Okay, we'll hear you again on this. This is new. So Paul went out from their midst, but some men joined him and believed, among whom were also Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So he got a few people from this. It wasn't the Peter sermon where we have thousands of people believing. Paul got a couple. He's in a tough environment. He's in a secular environment. But you look at how he shares. He shares does he quote the line of King David? Does he talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Is there any Judaism in there? No, there's not. He knows who he is sharing with. So that is a very important fact as we share our faith, to know what is going to resonate with people and not just take our Bible and beat them over the head with it. We got to know what's going to resonate with folks. Next point, the cultural milieu. If you learn nothing today, you're going to learn what the word milieu means. The milieu is a social backdrop. It's what our culture is. It's a social environment. It's a setting. It's a context. Every culture has its own cultural backdrop. We've got a cultural milieu. And I want you to think, because I'm going to ask a question. Do you think that people are more or less receptive to the gospel today? Okay. You can answer it out loud or in your head. I don't care. I got a couple out loud people. My extroverts and my introverts answered it in their heads. That's cool. More or less. I think we're all thinking less. Because our cultural milieu, our cultural backdrop has changed from the way it used to be. There may have been a time when you could walk up to someone, or you can end an argument by saying, God said it, I believe it, that settles it. Man, yeah, you just played the trump card. That could end an argument maybe in some time. You say that today to any seasoned intellectual who's secular, and you're just going to confirm what they already think. You're going to confirm to them whatever prejudice or bias they have, that we're not thinking people. We want to be seen as thinking people. We want there to be a cultural backdrop where Christianity is an intellectually viable option, which is why it's so great we have those philosophers and historians out there doing good work and defeating arguments. We're going to talk about the four horsemen of the new atheists. These are guys that go around debating. They're popular on Twitter. Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, Bart Ehrman. These guys all have books. God is Dead, Forged, the story of how the Gospels were forged. I'm going to give you the counter arguments to that, but these guys are out there trying to eat us, trying to eat Christians alive in arguments, and we've got people out there debating them, which is great, because what we do in church is really neat. But when there's public debates between a Christian philosopher and one of these heroes of the new atheists, and the Christian holds his own or wins the debate, that is awesome for our cultural backdrop. That Christianity can be seen as something that can stand up to the rigors of academia. That Christianity is something that is an intellectually okay thing to believe in. That's so important for those of us that are sending children off to college, or if you are one of those young adults going to college, it is so important that you believe that your faith can be defended. Now at age 18, you may not be the one to defend it. You may have to sit there and receive some of those arguments and not respond back. But to know that there are responses and that you know where to go to find them can embolden you for Christ. The cultural milieu can even change from city to city. I think Rockwall, I've lived here since 2010, so that's 8 years. And grew up in San Antonio and spent about 7-8 years in a college in a city environment, and then I come to Rockwall. So I've got big city, intellectual environment, small town, dare I say Bible Belt. And you got to say Bible when you say Bible Belt. Maybe I didn't go to the right spots in San Antonio, but I'd never been to a Chick-fil-A or Starbucks where there's people opening their Bibles and praying. I mean, we have such a neat backdrop here in this county, but it's not an example of the way the world really is. You go to those places in uptown Dallas, you go to some of those intellectual debates that are being hosted in universities across the nation, and it's a much more hostile place. And those are the grounds where we can stick up for our faith. William Lane Craig is one of those Christian philosophers, and he's one of the people I may quote from time to time. He's got some great books out there. He says that the gospel is never heard in isolation. It's always heard against the background of the cultural milieu in which one lives. A person raised in a cultural backdrop in which Christianity is seen as an intellectually viable option will display an openness to the gospel. For a secular person, you may as well tell him to believe in leprechauns or fairies as to believe in Jesus Christ. And he tells a story about if you were to go share with someone on the street, maybe in Rockwall, Texas, he doesn't say Rockwall, but if you were to share on the street with someone from Rockwall, Texas and talk about Jesus, they'd have a general idea of where you're going with that. If you were to go share in the streets of Bombay, India, about someone who grew up under Hinduism about Jesus, they've got no clue where you're going. You're basically introducing a leprechaun or a fairy to them. There's got to be some backdrop against which the gospel is heard. And their backdrop, you're telling them to believe in something fictional. So Craig he went to Europe, and he talks about sharing in Europe. We've got postmodern, secularized, post-secularized Europe, right? Where no one goes to church anymore. He talks about sharing in Europe, and he felt like he was basically telling people to believe in leprechauns when he was sharing as a young man. And he said, something's got to be done about this. These people, they don't see that this is true, and they don't see that this is even an option for them. They think this is just a story or a fairy tale. Another important point. Previously, we may be able to stick our head in the sand. Decades ago, we probably could. Today, the objections find us, and they find us through social media and the internet. I mean, you can open up Facebook, and you got that crazy friend that's always updating random stuff, and the objections are flying, or they're dogging Christianity. So while we used to be able to put our heads in the sand, we've got tweets and retweets, and these things find us. And enough of that builds up over time. And I can tell you from personal experience, it takes away your boldness, because you think everybody out there thinks this is a hoax, or everybody out there thinks I'm a dimwit. I mean, I like my church, I go to church, I know what I have with God is real, but I'm not going to dare say anything about it because I don't want to be seen as some moron. And that's the way they make me feel. So the internet makes these objections find us. So we've got to do a job of building ourselves up so we can respond to that. Finally, I want to end with, on this point, our children. Andy Staley says that, unfortunately, years of sermons, camps, mission trips, personal devotions can be undermined by a single lecture in a university setting. Sunday school answers are no match for the rigors of academia. They don't fare much better on the weight of adulthood either. While a previous generation of Christians had the option to stick their heads in the sand and tune out the voices of skeptics, Christians today don't have that luxury. The internet has changed the game. There's 2 points there. Number one is sending our children to if you go to a non-Christian college where I went, there's an overwhelming anti-Christian bias among the professors. Where I went, it wasn't really among the students, but among the professors, you just kind of had to go along with it if you wanted an A. And we're thrusting our children into environments like that where they've either got to know that there's good reasons for what they believe or they're going to leave. Lee Strobel, in his book, The Case for Christ, says, I had read enough philosophy and history to find support for my skepticism. A fact here, a scientific theory there, a pithy quote, a clever argument. My question to us is, have we read any? Do we know any arguments that can respond? I hope we've read some, and I hope these 12 weeks can take us on that journey. I hope you're on your way to becoming convinced that this is an important study for us to be doing. Fourth, this really builds us up. So we've done this a few times in this church, and I feel like every time that we've done this, people have left encouraged. They've left emboldened. They've taken a handout, or they've asked for a handout and said, I know someone who needs to be at that next lesson, and I want to give this to them. Or do you have notes from that? And that's my goal here. And if we accomplish nothing else, I'm not trying to make everybody an apologist, and I doubt I am even one. Just like to read and I like to talk. But if nothing if we accomplish nothing else, I hope that we as a church are emboldened for Christ and that we know there's good reasons for what we believe. So Craig is our Christian philosopher who goes and debates. He'll talk about going and debating the most vicious Christian eater on campus. So he'll go to an academic setting and he'll have whatever philosophy professor or maybe historian is known for just destroying 18-year-olds in his class. And he says he will go, and he often finds that while these people are really good at destroying 18-year-olds, they can't hold a candle to one of their peers when they're held to those standards and when they debate them. If you've ever seen some of these debates, they're wonderful. And he'll leave these debates, and he'll have Christian students just so encouraged and so on fire, not to go argue with their professor, go get your A, but they're so encouraged and so on fire to go share, to know that there are great reasons to believe what they believe, and they don't have to walk around campus just having these professors beat them up all the time because they saw someone beat that guy up. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, he says, the weapons of our warfare are not flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. Now that's a big thing, and Paul probably could destroy any argument. We're not there yet, and that's all right. But that's something we can aspire to, is to have that knowledge and to know those things. But before we get carried away, and this is where I personally have had some struggle. You get going one direction in apologetics and you feel like, I've spent all this time in intellectual land, what happened with me and God? And you get going with God and it's like, I don't really know the arguments anymore. And you go over here. And I don't want you to think of this like that. I think they're congruent. So you have the preaching of the gospel. Well, that's for non-believers and for believers. We need to hear the gospel to continue to be built up. Didn't do it. We need to hear the gospel to continue to be built up. But we also need apologetics as well to continue to be built up. I want you to think of your faith as a city as we go through these 12 weeks. Think of it as a big, beautiful, medieval city. But apologetics are the walls that surround that city. You've got to have walls around that city to defend it. And the good part about apologetics is arguments come and go. There may be an argument, okay, well, that one doesn't hold water anymore. Well, knock that wall down, build up a new one. The city never changes. You want to grow the city, but you also want to grow the walls that are defending that city at the same time. So don't think of your own quiet time as opposite of intellectual study. They go together. And I want to end with a point on balance. Charles Spurgeon says, I confess that I do not believe that one human brain is capable of answering every objection that another human brain can raise against the most obvious truth in the world. So he says, I don't think that one human brain is capable of answering every objection that another human brain can raise against the most obvious truth in the world. Keep that in mind. We are not going to come away from this knowing absolutely everything, ready to destroy all the arguments. I don't want there to be that pressure on us. We've got to keep that in mind as we go forward. But what we can do is help. We can be that stone in someone's shoe because it's going to help them. We can push them a little bit further on the path. And I want to end with this note. Frank Turek, he's at a debate, post-debate. He's a Christian. Post-debate, students asking questions of him in an informal environment. And the student, he's just answering all the objections. And he finally asks the student, he says, let me ask you a question. If I were to answer every single one of your objections to your complete satisfaction, would you fall on your knees and become a believer in Christ? The student says, I guess I wouldn't. Another point, talked about Craig before. Craig is talking with Christopher Hitchens, says kind of the same thing, and says, listen, I've answered all your objections. When are you going to be ready to become a believer? If I had a scientific explanation for every single thing that you're coming at me with, would you become a believer? And Christopher Hitchens says, in his English accent, well, it sounds rather close-minded if I say no, doesn't it? Yes, because it's a heart thing. So know as we go through this that these arguments, they may just be fodder for conversation. They keep the conversation going with somebody, but their issue may be in their heart. I know that's what it was for me when I went to college and I strayed. It was a heart thing. Man, the world looked good to me. And I didn't have a strong enough faith to stay with my God. And man, I wish I did. But it wasn't a professor that beat me up. It was my heart. It was my heart. So let's keep in mind that when we're doing this, we are speaking to people's hearts. And we got to know where they are. We've got to know that we may answer this objection. They're going to come tomorrow with a new one. But I'm having that conversation because I love them. And I'm going and I'm finding answers to their questions to keep this conversation going. I want to end with an encouraging note that we are free from having to become experts in all this subject matter. We can always go look it up, and we can always ask each other. There's great resources out there. So if you've seen, I've passed out the handouts, you've got the schedule. If you know someone that would benefit from coming to any particular class, please bring them. Let me close us in prayer. Father, I thank you so much for this platform and this opportunity to bring this material to my brothers and sisters in Christ. I pray that through this study we are built up, we are emboldened, and that we learn to love you with all of our minds. I pray that people can come to Christ through this, and that our believers who are here and those who may come can be emboldened to share Christ to others. I ask your blessing be upon all of us. In the name of Jesus, amen. See you next time. Please come back.